Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being patient as everybody assembles. Congress is back in town and the traffic is thicker than the rest of the year this week in particular, so I appreciate you coming out and coming out early. I'm Doug Paul. I'm Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here this morning, but also to serve as the person to introduce the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Jonathan Greenert, who's come here to talk to us today about, I think, many things, but he's put a lot of time into a field that I can see a lot of people here know a lot about, which is China and China's military in recent couple of months. And we'll be doing more this next few weeks up in Newport when we'll have Chinese participants among many at the big symposium that will be held there. Without further ado, I'd like to have the honor to welcome Admiral Greenert to the podium. Thank you.
Very much. Well, this is going to be challenging in a whole host of ways. When I grew up and went to the Pentagon for my very first time, it became very clear to me that the colonels and the captains were always grouchier on a Monday morning following a Redskins loss. So I don't know where you guys stand. Thank goodness we have baseball in this town, winning baseball, so maybe there'll be a decent balance here. I'm banking on that. So thanks a lot, Dr. Paul, for that introduction, and thank you for your service in the government. I was talking to Doug that, in fact, he was serving as the director of the American Institute in Taiwan during a very, very key and critical part of our time in the Western Pacific. And in fact, a certain election, had it gone a different way, history would show things very differently. But that's history. You did well. We're here. This is a very prestigious institute, and I'm very pleased to be here, honored to be here. If I'm not mistaken, it's the oldest international affairs think tank in the United States and was in fact launched the same year as the first aircraft, Navy aircraft launched from a ship in 1910. Eugene Eli's flight from the USS Birmingham down in Norfolk and Hampton Roads across Willoughby Bay. And in fact, if you go down there and you go down to Norfolk and you at the station, there's a nice little plaque there, and you look across the way, and they said that's where the Birmingham was anchored the same year that this institute was launched and came across. And so I'm thinking, you're looking across there, it's years ago, it's foggy, it's misty, and somebody's saying, well, what's going on? Has he launched yet? And they say, yeah, he's launched, and somebody looks out through the fog and says, Eli's coming. And at that very moment, the way it goes, it is said that the grandfather of the writer for the group Three Dog Night was in fact in that crowd and scribbled all that down. And in 1970, his grandson wrote a very famous song that those of you laughing, just showing your age, the fact that you actually realize that. And if you believe that, you'll believe just about anything I say, so I was testing you. I'll talk a little bit about what I call the presence mandate for the Navy, the Asia-Pacific rebalance, and a little bit about the China relationship, delving, of course, in the Navy. But for us in the Navy, our mandate is to be where it matters, when it matters. And the question sometimes becomes, well, where does it matter? And we determine that in the Department of Defense by the Global Force Management Allocation Plan, where we distribute our forces, including Navy forces. If you put up the first slide here, I just have a few graphics to show you. So where are we today? Where does it matter out there around the world? Well, you can see the distribution. You can see that the Asia-Pacific remains over half of the ships, or just about exactly half of the ships that we have, 101 ships deployed of the 291 that we have today. Oddly enough, 20 years ago, we had 400 ships. We had 101 forward deployed. A lot of those factors are how many we are actually putting forward semi-permanently, where those ships are there with sailors, the ship, and their families in what we call the forward deployed naval force, a lot in Japan, some in Rota, some in Bahrain and other areas of the world, or we'll forward station the ship and we'll rotate the crew. And we're doing that in Bahrain today, and we'll continue that concept with littoral combat ships. Or we'll contract the ship with civilian mariners, and they'll give us about 270 days a year forward deployed, and we'll rotate military detachment. But this is where we are today. And it's about our missions, freedom of navigation and security in critical global regions. The areas that here you can kind of see, some of you have seen or heard me talk, I go through this every single time. Those are valves. They can be bow ties if you're a political science major, whatever. That is where a lot of the trade of our world moves. Trillions and trillions of dollars. I call it the maritime crossroads. It's Monday morning. Some of you ran out and grabbed a coffee. If you grabbed a coffee by that famous maker in the Pacific Northwest, they get most of that coffee from the East Africa region. It's got to be fresh. It's got to get from East Africa through by Somalia, the Aden, the Gulf of Aden, the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, the Suez Canal, the Gibraltar, the Strait of Gibraltar, and then the Panama Canal up to the Pacific Northwest. It's a long trek. It has to be open all the time. All the trade, as we're hyper-connected, has got to move, and we can't afford interruptions. Even the thermal sleeve, when you got your coffee today, is coming from Scandinavia, and that's got to get down through the Panama Canal. So as you look up there and you look at where those crossroads are, where a lot of that trade goes, ask yourself if that's a secure region, or if has it been, and will it be in the future. And that's why we're out and about, to assure, to dissuade, to deter, and if need be, to respond. And we've done that as needed over the last 18 months quite a few times. About 18 months ago, it was North Korea. It was Iran's threats in the Strait of Hormuz. Then it was Syria. We were ready in the Ukraine crisis, and now it's Iraq. But also natural man-made disasters. The Philippine typhoon, the tragic loss of the airlines, the Malaysian airline, and then Japan's earthquake and tsunami that took place a while back. So our mandate, where it matters, when it matters, we have to be out and about. But a few words on the rebalance, as Doug said. I'll talk about that. We've had a historic and an enduring interest in Asia, in the Pacific Ocean and in the Indian Ocean. Over half of the world's tonnage passes through the Straits of Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok down there in the Indonesia-Singapore region. A third of the global crude oil and half of the liquid natural gas moves through the South China Sea. 5 of the top 15 trading partners for us are right out there in that region. And we've been there for 7 decades of continuous Asia-Pacific naval presence. We're going to be there in the future. For us, the rebalance, for the Navy, the rebalance can be kind of put into 3 basic areas, 3 ways, I should say: forces, capabilities, and understanding. In the area of forces, we put our most modern forces in the Western Pacific, and we are increasing the presence out there as we're moving forces out there. The next year, in 2015, we'll have 2 more destroyers. These are Aegis destroyers, high-end fire control systems in Japan, another submarine in Guam, and many of you are aware we are working toward forward stationing 4 little combat ships down in the Singapore at Changi Pier. Capabilities-wise, in the Pacific area of responsibility, we benchmark our capabilities. And it's about electronic warfare, undersea warfare, advanced anti-air warfare, and, of course, cyber. It's also about understanding, as I mentioned. It's about relations and exchanges. And I'll get to that in a little more depth. But it's about allies and assuring those allies, developing new partners and assuring them, and figuring out how do we work with ad hoc partners. How do we gather together as an international, if you will, network of navies to work on a tragedy or something that involves all of us, such as the loss of an airliner or a natural disaster. So we're going to be in this region. Economically and politically, it's critical. And we'll be staying in the South China Sea, and we'll be staying in the East China Sea. But our collective actions, all of us, have to promote stability and trust. Now, recently, April, in China, in Qingdao, at the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, I think we took a pretty good step forward. We would be the 22 navies that border the Pacific that agreed to sign a code for unplanned encounters at sea, laying down the protocol that will govern our interactions. Again, it was voluntary, and it will establish the professional behavior and the clear communication that we need to help reduce the uncertainty of what's going to happen when we encounter each other and increase safety. Now, we exercised this QUIS, as it's kind of known, recently at RIMPAC, just in July, where Brunei, Indonesia, Singapore, the Chinese Navy, and the United States, we gathered together. We met right around Guam, and we sailed to Hawaii, where we had the RIMPAC exercise, and we worked through these details and the different processes of QS. We're going to meet again, as Mr. Paul mentioned here, in the International Sea Power Symposium next week. 113 delegates from the navies around the world, and we'll discuss the idea of expanding to our coast guards and other global regions this QS concept. With multilateral exercises and standards of behavior, we can move ahead, and I would say it's a mandate for all of us to do this so that we can contribute to safe operations in the international waterways and the airspace around there, prevent accidents, but most importantly, preclude miscalculation. We've got 38 to 42-year-old commanding officers out there responsible for 300 to 700 people on average out there at sea of various countries steaming in the areas of the world, and it's getting some tense in some areas. They need to have a clarity of purpose and an understanding of how we will interact with each other and having the right protocols, reinforcing international law and the norms that need there, and frankly, using confidence-building measures among all of us. Now, the rebalance, a little more on it. We've been strengthening our relations in the Pacific region for decades. Can you put the first build up there? And that has resulted, I would submit, in the vibrant part of the international economy that we have, especially in the Asia-Pacific and especially in the East Asia-Pacific. We have stalwart allies and interests in the region, and while 5 of our 7 U.S. treaties, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Southeast Asia are right out there in this region. The United States and Australia just recently solidified and formally signed the Force Posture Agreement, where we will provide, or we have been offered, and we will do rotational deployment of Marines to Darwin there in Australia. So we recently sealed the deal on that one, if you will. We have critical alliances with Republic of Korea and with Japan, and we've recently completed exercise Ulchi Freedom Guardian. Some of you may have known it as Ulchi Focus Lens because it's been going on for 60-plus years with Korea, and we will continue to do that exercise. With Japan, we've had a recent development that is still working its way through, and that would be the idea of collective self-defense, enabling, in my world, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force to do more operations together with us in collective defense. Our focus in this region is improved interoperability. To me, that's the number one thing we need to work on, and we're doing that. As I mentioned earlier, we just completed RIMPAC in July timeframe. Just before RIMPAC, the Republic of Korea Navy, the Japanese Navy, and U.S. Navy did an exercise, trilat exercise called Pacific Dragon, where we shared the tracks for a ballistic missile launched off of the island of Kauai. That's kind of unprecedented. The capabilities have been there, but getting together and doing those trilats is something we need to continue to do. And then we went ahead and did RIMPAC among the other 22 nations, those 3, Japan, Korea, and the U.S., working together. So that area is an important, kind of a high-end area, but I think the key to this rebalance. Now, if you look down in Southeast Asia, the key, I think, down there is Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. We have an exercise series called Cooperation Afloat Readiness and Training. That's been around for 20 years, but we are stepping it up more recently down in the region down in there. And there's possibilities out here with Vietnam. Recent deliberations with the Vietnamese have shown a willingness to develop a naval engagement activity strategy, something carrot-like, something like cooperation afloat alike, but we're going to work on this in a manner that makes sense with the Vietnamese. Recently, the Malaysians have offered us to fly detachments of P-8s out of east, right out here in East Malaysia, so you can see the closeness to the South China Sea. So we have opportunities here, and I think we got to continue to nurture them, and that's a region that we'll continue to do that. There's a strategic partnership that I think we need to take a hard look at, and we have a golden opportunity, and we're going to take it, and that's with India. The new Modi government is an opportunity. We have had a long history of exercises, particularly with an exercise called Malabar. with the Indian Navy. And at one point, about a decade ago, we were at the point where we had multi-carrier operations. So we shared air wing operations, carrier operations, and actually conducted sub-on-sub operations with the Indian Navy. So I think if we can find those opportunities and work through the issues that we need to work through with the governments to get through that, we'll be further along, much further along. Recently, this year, in July, the Malabar exercise was a trilateral with India, Japan, and the U.S., including the George Washington carrier, and it was in the, if you will, in the North Philippine Sea, just south of Okinawa here earlier this year. So the China relationship, if I were to summarize it, I'd say we need to build a constructive relationship. That's what we've been directed to do, and that's where my focus of effort has been and will continue to be. Clearly, we've got the potential to prosper with China. They have the world's second largest economy, and we got a big stake in one another. They're our number 2 trading partner, our number 3 export market, and our number 1 importing source. Our trade in last year, 2013, was $562 billion, and we have almost $1.3 trillion in U.S. securities with them. So we got to go to work, in my view, and it's not a secret. It's pretty well known. The Chinese Navy is expanding into the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. They want to become a global Navy, but they tell me very clearly, their chief, that they don't intend to hold a global posture like we do. It's not something they want to do or something they can do right now. They have shown an ability to embrace international norms and standards. They do counter-piracy operations in the Aden area, and they do it quite effectively, and we've done exercises with them there in the Gulf of Aden. They participated with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief with their hospital ship in the Typhoon Haiyan in December of 2013. They participated in International Naval Exercise RIMPAC. Their ships that went there performed professionally and fit in fairly well, and they were well prepared. They have hosted, and as I mentioned before, we signed the QS there in Qingdao. So they have hosted. They're a part of the international dialogue of the symposia that take place. And I think that's commensurate with the rising Navy. It makes sense. I've had a lot of interaction with my counterpart, Admiral Wu Shengli, 4 times over the last year, which is more than I've had with other chiefs, but not to remove interactions with, not at the exclusion of other chiefs, I should say. I visited their carrier, Liaoning, and I happened to be the first uniformed American and uniformed officer and chief to visit the carrier. I held an all-hands call, and we talked about kind of consistent issues that we have among our 2 navies. I was able to get underway on what would be a corvette, about a 2,000-ton ship, and take a 2.5-hour cruise with Admiral Wu and the crew of the ship, one of their newer ships. Visited one of their newer submarines and got a tour on a guided missile PC. So it was an interesting visit. I think it was more transparency, more openness than I had seen in the past, and Admiral Wu and I had some pretty frank and candid conversations. But in the end, we're working on 7 initiatives. I would characterize them as such, to practice QS in a deliberate and a structured manner, to move our navies ahead in this thing that we both agreed to continue on, to increase the number of port visits between us and China and the United States, to establish kind of a drumbeat of regular communications between Admiral Wu and myself, to increase academic exchanges, and I'm talking about our academies, our fleet schools, and our war colleges, to work on our human resource best practices. He also wants a diverse Navy. I want a diverse Navy. He has to build an officer corps. We're building an officer corps. So to talk about how to do that, and to work on pre-approved exercises, so that when, as we mentioned before, when 2 ships pass in the Gulf of Aden or somewhere, we can work take that opportunity for 2 skippers of 2 big navies to work together and do an exercise that's pre-approved. Today, we've got to do an exercise that has to go up to their Minister of Defense and to our Department of Defense. So these are the issues that we're working on. But as I said before, it's not the exclusion of working with our allies and our partners out there. We'll remain a strong Navy ally out there to our partners. And although I have had some time with a lot of time with Admiral Wu Shengli. In the last year, I've been to Japan twice to meet with my counterpart, Korea, the Philippines 2 times, to Malaysia and to Indonesia, and also to Singapore. So we're keeping a balance as we work out there. So as I close here, let me tell you that we'll continue to engage, to shape, and to lead. We'll continue to be where it matters, when it matters. As was mentioned earlier, next week we're hosting the biannual symposium called the International Sea Power Symposium. We'll host it at Newport at our War College. We'll have 113 nations with 78 heads of Navy and a requisite number of heads of Coast Guard. And we're going to talk about the shared challenges to security and prosperity. So it's global solutions to common problems. That's what we're going to talk about. Because to meet the challenge, no one nation can do it alone. And in my view, we got to use this network of navies. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, Admiral, thank you very much for those remarks. I think we all benefit from periodic exposure to the amount of activity that you and the American Armed Forces are engaged in around the world.
Thank you.
You hear about it when somebody's dispatched a carrier to the Gulf or something like that, but you don't realize that this day-to-day hard work goes on to be prepared for what has to be done. This is the year everybody's talking about what happened in 1914 and the beginning of World War I. I did a lot of time this year reading about the beginning of the Second World War, 1939 to 1941. And one of the things that really struck me was how it was the internationalized experienced Navy officers in Japan who were most reluctant to support the effort to go to war with the United States back then. They had seen the U.S., they'd gone to school in the U.S., and when you jump forward to today and you talk about getting to know the Chinese and trying to keep people from misunderstanding each other and having a good appreciation of your potential adversary, you think China basically took itself out of the Navy game 600 years ago when they scuttled the world's best fleet in the early 1400s. Now they're coming back. They got a long way to go. And as I'm sure you're experiencing yourself, when people call for this to be cut off for this reason or that reason, I say, we've got a bigger game to play here, and I hope we can keep it up. Thanks for letting me make that advertisement. I wanted to ask you, sir, you haven't mentioned it today, but one of the things that was a signature initiative of yours on arrival at your present position was in the air-sea battle concept. I wonder if you could give me a sense of how you see the air-sea battle concept today.
Well, as we talked about it before, it is truly a concept. It's a way to think about what I would call joint assured access. And a lot of people say, oh, so you're talking about the Western Pacific. Oh, we would certainly apply there to get where we need to get the things done we need to get done. But more than anything, I would say it is a way to put into place a concept, a mindset among our officers for dealing with getting access. We applied it in Japan to get access to a radioactively contaminated, power plant to measure those levels. So how are we going to get in there to do that? And we sat down and did that planning. It would be effective in the Strait of Hormuz. It would be effective clearly in the Western Pacific. So it's getting the mindset right, doing the exercises and thinking about that. It's about using cross-domain capability and turning to the air and the sea, below the sea, space and cyber, and saying, what's the best domain to get this done? Maybe it's a missile from a submarine, or maybe it's a air-to-surface missile from an aircraft, or maybe it's turning to as a cyber solution. But until you sit down and have that kind of mindset from the very beginning and bring that all home, you're going to start turning to your traditional manner. We do pretty well today proceeding with the forces that we have and figuring out how to operate jointly. But it's what we have and what we bring there. What we don't do as well is in our war colleges, sitting down with our folks and training our kids and doing our programs that we build here at the Pentagon, thinking in that kind of joint and interdependence manner And that's the foundation and what's going on in air-sea battle. So we're looking much more at it as a broader concept than just, what is the Air Force and the Navy doing? We're bringing in the other services and the cyber element, and that's what the team is working on today.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to open the floor to questions. Remind you, please, wait for a microphone so the cameras can hear you. And identify yourself and your affiliation, please, when you're called upon. Back here.
Thank you.
Just speak into it, should work.
Thank you, Admiral. My name is Gulf of Aden with Chinese Navies. 2 weeks ago, the U.S. and China was discussing the code of conduct just after the encounter incident nearby Hainan Island. I'm wondering what progress you have made in any area in this regard, and particularly on the issue of the U.S. Surveillance activities nearby in the international space nearby China. And are you concerned about that this similar encounter will happen more frequently in the future? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer your last question first. Yeah, I am concerned that such unprofessional activity, and we've had clear documentation that it was unprofessional. I am concerned that that would happen in the future. But I will say this, that incident, and you're talking about the incident where one of our maritime patrol aircraft flying in international airspace well over 100 plus miles from the coast was intercepted, and that's fine. That incident was inconsistent with how we've had air encounters in the future. Many of them, the vast majority of them are professional. The Russians fly near our airspace and we intercept them. There is a norm for activity and for two aircraft entities operating safely and, as I said, with due protocol. And that is pretty well known by all our pilots. So it shouldn't have happened, I believe, but it shouldn't also define our relationship. But we will continue to operate in international airspace. We've made that clear, and we'll proceed ahead from there. We will continue the dialogue. We have to have the dialogue with our requisite counterparts. And I might get that opportunity next week when I see Admiral Wu in Newport to discuss this with him.
In the third row. Yeah.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. I just want to continue on that because you have, as a U.S. official, seems to avoid whether the U.S. is going to reduce that surveillance or, which Chinese have expressed as being offensive or provocative. And maybe many U.S. experts also said something like that. The other, from your talk, is Chinese see maybe some of your strategy maybe very differently. You say going to strengthen military cooperation with Vietnam, but certainly it's not directed at North Korea. So how you convince Chinese it's not directed at Chinese? Thank you.
Yes, well, that will be an interesting conversation, which I assure you we will have with the Chinese Navy as to what our first step would be. What is the interest of Vietnam? And we'll have to have that conversation. And I've not had that conversation. For example, what kind of skills would we want to work on with the Vietnamese Navy? As an example, we work on predominantly counter-piracy, we work on counter-terrorism, we work on search and rescue, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. In that CARROT series that I referred to before, Cooperation Afloat, Readiness Training, down in Southeast Asia, that would be the consistent kind of skills that we would work with Southeast Asia nations, what I just said, which is a common purpose for a common problem, as opposed to working together with to target some other navy or nation. That's not consistent with how we do international operations in the U.S. Navy.
Surveillance?
Come again?
Surveillance?
Surveillance, such as, you mean with Vietnam?
No, I mean reduce the surveillance amount of Chinese coast.
There's no intention that I'm aware of to do that. We're flying in international airspace. China comes and steams in our exclusive economic zone. We don't make a big deal out of it. The Russians have in the Cold War flown in our international airspace. And so this is not new, the whole concept of it.
Over here on the aisle, Buck Cole.
Admiral Bud Cole, National War College. One of your predecessors once said that if full sequestration takes effect, that the Navy's not going to be able to maintain the usual sort of constant deployments that you mentioned, but would have to go to sort of a fire brigade reaction. Would you agree that's one of the dangers, or do you believe the Navy's modified operational context enough that that would not be a factor?
Well, I don't know what a fire brigade. I think that's what you said, fire brigade? Or?
Yes, sir. Everybody be home port and you'd only deploy when there was a crisis.
Oh, I see, yes. No, that would not be my approach. I believe our mandate is presence, and during my tenure, and as I've studied this before, and as I look into the future, we have to be, as I say, we have to be where it matters when it matters. If we go to Budget Control Act numbers, that presence, we will work toward the same principles that I described before. Our strategy won't change, but we'll be in a tremendous struggle to maintain an industrial base, to maintain an appropriate size Navy, and we won't be able to maintain the strategy that is the Defense Strategic Guidance missions that we do today. It will be a completely different look. And we've been pretty clear testifying to that, all of the chiefs, but no, I wouldn't propose that we would go to, if you will, a more where we would return home and only respond and surge. My experience is I've watched the world today, and I look around, I rattle off all those things that happened just in the last 18 months. On that slide, if you go put the Navy Today slide up there, please, and on the lower right left-hand corner there, you see how long it takes to get from CONUS to a place. 3 weeks to get somewhere, 2 weeks. I mean, it's either festered into a really bad situation or it's over. And I don't think we can do that.
We're here in the front row.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Sidney Friedberg, BreakingDefense.com. You mentioned electronic warfare, you mentioned air-sea battle, and I wanted to get your reaction, your thoughts on an issue that Alan Schaffer from Department of Defense Research Engineering raised the other week. He said, it was kind of startling, we have lost the electromagnetic spectrum, that we need to regain dominance or at least parity. He was deeply concerned about the proliferation of affordable low-cost jamming, for example, around the world. An issue beyond the West Pac, but clearly, Asia is where a lot of electronics come from. How concerned are you about having lost parity or losing our edge in the electronic spectrum?
I disagree that we've, if you will, lost parity, but we have lost momentum. I would put it that way, but I think we can regain it. This is not a new realm for us. First thing you got to do is you got to be able to maneuver in the electromagnetic spectrum. You got to understand your emissions, your potential adversaries' emissions. That would be frequency, wavelength, where they're using it, and then you got to get out there and manipulate yourself in it. So there are a lot of programs in that direction, Sydney. We have got to inject adrenaline into the whole concept. You know that. I've been talking about this for a while. That's my view of it. But I believe we can. We have to remain focused on it, both investment-wise and operational-wise. We have lost momentum. I don't think we've lost parity.
Next one is John Zong from CTI TV.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Admiral. 2 questions. Excuse me for not standing for the sake of the cameras in the back.
I understand.
First off, I know you are not in charge of arms sales to Taiwan, but Taiwan has been trying to buy submarines for many years to no avail. As a mariner yourself for many years, do you have any suggestions for the people in Taiwan or your colleagues in Taiwan in terms of building submarines on their own? That's the first question. Second question, I know you were saying that incidents like the South China Sea stand-up, between Chinese and American navies, and also the kind of intercept over the skies of the South China Sea do not define U.S.-China mil-to-mil relationship. But, apart from expressions of constructive relationship that both leaders from both sides want, all we hear in the press is the kind of, standoffs or intercepts. What is the real situation? What is the current state of mil-to-mil relationship between the two countries?
Feel free to pass the sub-question to me.
Well, I'll tell you, yes, I've had conversations with my my Taiwan counterpart. I won't discuss them here. I can't. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll leave it to Mr. Paul from there. But, I don't think that this air incident should define the relationship, but I think it should be noted. And in that so I'll go on and say, remember the Cowpens incident? That would be before everybody goes, whoa, how about that? Well, what happened after the Cowpens puts on the brakes and comes to a halt is the commanding officer, Liao Ning, gets on the international circuit and said, what's going on over there? And he and the commanding officer of the Cowpens have a conversation on the Cowpens' intent, the Liao Ning's intent, and what operations they're doing. They work it out, and they find mutual, protocol, if you will, or a mutual understanding of who's going to do it. The whole thing diffuses. There are examples, I've given some, I can connect you with my public affairs officer, where we've met, that is, we're at sea, and our two commanding officers, Chinese ship, U.S. warship, have a conversation and go their ways. Now, I may note that this agreement is between two navies. That doesn't mean Coast Guard yet is going to comply, and that we're going to all speak English, or some auxiliary or supporting ship on both sides. But we're working toward that. But what we've seen examples of, again, my public affairs can help you, are Chinese Navy ships coming in to help preclude, to help, if you will, run a blocking maneuver to keep somebody from getting in too close, complying with the international norms out there. So this is going on. I just gave you the exercise when we went to RIMPAC. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think we are we're progressing ahead. Bottom line, we cannot have miscalculation. As Dr. Paul mentioned, opening this up, the beginning of World War II, the beginning of World War I, a lot of miscalculation. The more I read about it, people not understanding the intention of somebody else. I don't want to be a part of that, and I think it's my job to keep the South China Sea calm and the East China Sea calm. And I think working together is a step in the right direction to do that.
In the front row here, Mitzi.
Mitzi Worth, I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I'm thrilled, frankly, to hear what you're saying, because somehow I haven't picked up your behavior in the press.
That's usually a good sign when you use the term behavior. But anyway.
It's all about behavior. It's about human beings.
I didn't read a bunch on the paper today.
Anyway, I'm going to ask you a question as a member of the Joint Staff. Last week I heard Michelle Flournoy talk about the QDR. Mm-hmm. And to be quite honest, what I understood from her, it sounded like the stuff that was going on in the Pentagon when I was there 37 years ago. And I kept thinking, doing the QDR, do you start with what are the lessons learned we've acquired in the last 10 years, and how would that apply to creating our thinking for a new plan? And if that's going on, I would feel much better. But I certainly didn't get that from Michelle. And so much, in an institution that's so big, it's so easy to fall back on, well, this was last year's budget, this was last year's plan. We'll just continue to do that. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd say process-wise, we have learned a great deal from things like counter-IED, how to stand up an organization which can take a today problem, and we need to stop casualties on the battlefield today. And you read, Mr. Gates' book, you'll see details of that, how he fought through that, and then put together a means to get what I call speed to fleet. Gary Ruffhead actually started. I should give the kudos where they belong, but to carry that on. So how do you quickly acquire something? MRAPs would be another larger program. How to put together an office to go out there and find, and Frank Kendall talks about this a lot today, find capabilities that are coming forward out of research and development and get them into test and evaluation. We have learned a good deal from that, and that is being brought forward and applied. Come again?
And into training.
And into training,
Your
yeah,
story
yeah.
about building your
Yeah. So air-sea battle is an example of the collaboration among the services, not just on getting together when you operate. That's when you already have all your gear. But it's backing up to if not the gestation of the program, the concept, and then starting to share that and putting that together. Because we call it interdependence. Joint operations is great, but interdependence among each other. We have Army Air Force, we have Navy Air Force, Navy Army. You get warfighter talks where we get together and take action on that. So this is going on, but as you said, you don't read about it all out there, but it's happening. A lot of it is fiscal survival, being able to continue to get that capability out there. And if it really resides in the Army or in the Air Force, then they ought to be the ones to bring it forward, and then we have to make it compatible. So compatibility.
You mentioned, Admiral, that Carnegie is the oldest think tank. As a representative example, we have in the front row here Michael Swain from Carnegie. Yeah. Get the microphone.
Thank you. Michael Swain, Carnegie Endowment. I'd like to ask you a question, sort of two questions, but they're related because I ask you to look a little bit into the future. One of them is to do with Japan. You mentioned in your remarks about Japan's move towards collective self-defense and reinterpretation. What would you like to see happen in terms of U.S. Navy and maritime self-defense force capabilities that the Japanese can't do today, that you'd like to see them doing in the future, perhaps under collective self-defense or even further? How would you like to, and the other question is, can you see a time in the future when the U.S. and Chinese navies would work together in a really interoperable nature to do things like SLOC defense? In other words, that task would not be entirely left to the U.S. Navy in the big sense, not just Gulf of Aden counter-piracy sort of thing, but the basic capabilities of keeping Straits of Malacca and other things open. Can you foresee a time when the U.S. and China would work together to do that sort of thing?
Yes, so I'll answer the last one first. I can see that. Those are the kind of skill sets that we exercised at RIMPAC. Although, China came and did some very complex, from simple to highly complex gunnery exercises and, maneuvers and all that. What we did together as a sort of a ad hoc coalition was maritime security operations. That would be what you described: boarding, visit, board, search, seizure, and then you have levels. And you get up to the third level where somebody is opposing that. And we worked at those very high levels. Yes, I can see that. I think that's what responsible navies have to do. I think that the neighborhood of nations would turn to us and say, hey, we don't have what you have, so you guys should be keeping this place free, freedom of navigation. To answer your first question, two examples off the bat that I think should be concerning to other nations for us in Japan: ballistic missile defense. We have a North Korean threat, and it's an international threat. And they have the missile, Japan does, and they have the fire control program, and they have the proven ability to use it, and we are interoperable, as I described earlier. That would fit in well. The second would be counter-mine, and in particular, keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. We are about to do an exercise here in November called, what else? International Mine Countermeasure Exercise. Pretty simple. You get more people if you keep it simple. And we will have 40 nations there, which is extraordinary because 2 years ago we had 20, about 24 actually. And so I think those are two clearly defensive, clearly international interest items that we could operate with Japan.
Back here in the fifth row, Mike, Mike.
Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. In 1995, President Clinton ordered the deployment of 2 carrier groups to the Straits of Taiwan with relative assurances from your predecessor at the time of the relative safety of those ships. Given what the Chinese have been doing with missiles and area denial, et cetera, would you or your successor be able to offer the President of the United States the same assurances with that kind of a deployment?
Well, it's always dangerous to take something in history and then bring it into today, but I'll speak in capability-wise. We've been working very hard. You're talking about anti-ship ballistic missile predominantly, which is targeted many say toward a carrier, and to some degree anti-ship cruise missile. We work very hard on defeating that. It is a kill chain that has to take place, and what I mean by that is you have to have the capability to detect a ship, an aircraft carrier, anything that large from quite a distance if you're going to be effective. So you have to detect it. You have to know that's what it is that you've detected. Then you have to track it long enough to be confident enough to go ahead and launch this ballistic missile. Then the ballistic missile has to travel far enough to turn its sensor on, turn and look and find what it's looking for, then track it, then move in and get a final strike, if you will. Any breakage in that chain or confidence therein is a mission failure. So I'm confident that we've made terrific headway in this direction, and we'll continue to move in that direction.
A good question, great answer. In the third row, please.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein, RIA Novosti. I would like you to address some more of these potential miscalculations. I know that you did just refer to China as a potential adversary, obviously not an adversary right now, but there is a perception that this pivot to the Pacific was for the purpose of containment. As far as I understand, that's still a perception. So what are the potential? What's the potential for miscalculations? What's the actual threat that we're looking at in our presence in the Pacific? And then also, if you could just address this upcoming symposium in Newport also.
Already done it.
And hurry up, will you? Right? Yes. All right. So may I leave you with a few things? I think China is an opportunity, and I underline that, and we have to take that opportunity. So I think that's very, very important right up front. Two, I've had, as I said, numerous conversations with my counterpart, Admiral Wu Shengli, and he's told me repeatedly, he understands that we're going to be there in the South China Sea. He understands we're not going anywhere, and he thinks we ought to be able to interoperate together. His point to me is, I'm going to be there too, by the way, because my nation says, these are our near seas. These are of interest to us. So then we look at each other and we say, so we're going to have to figure out how to do this right. And we both agree. You say, what's the potential for miscalculation? The potential for miscalculation is not educating our commanding officers and giving them the means and the protocol so that when they meet, instead of the first thing coming out of their mouth in a different language, is something saying, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. And the other one saying, in accordance with whatever, and where do we go from there? It's just not good. It should start with two seasoned professional mariners who are responsible for, like I said, 300 to 500 of their nation's folks aboard having a professional dialogue of what they're doing in this international medium called the sea. And as I mentioned, there's trillions of dollars and economies at stake here. We can't screw this up through miscalculation. That's my view.
I haven't seen any hands way in the back. I want to recognize someone. Okay, about 4 rows from the rear. A hand is up.
Ken Meyergard, World Docs. I thought it was instructive on your map of our deployments in the Western Pacific that the United States was nowhere to be seen. You sail a long way from our shores. Can you envision a world in which the Navy is used to actually defend our shores rather than threaten other people's shores, unless other than forced upon us by budgetary constraints?
Sure.
Or are such thoughts above your pay scale?
Well, what I didn't put up there, because I want to clobber it with numbers, there's roughly 200 ships back in the United States and the East and West Coast. There was a little, go and put the slide up there. The dots are, there it is, 190 ships. There you go. And they are on the East and West Coast. So they are assigned to the commander called NORTHCOM, Northern Command. And they are operationally, upon his need, he says, I need these, whatever it is. And we say, they're yours. So there are a host of ships operating, usually about 40 on the West Coast and about, 20 to 30. I can get you the numbers if you're interested. On the East Coast, operating. And they're readily available for defense of the United States. the number one mission of the Department of Defense in the Defense Strategic Guidance, which is the foundation for all our programs, is Homeland Defense. And that's just not strategic nuclear, although that's a key and critical part of it. It's the what we would provide, which is presence on the East and West Coast. And by the way, I failed to mention my little friend down there in Guantanamo Bay. Don't forget that. You have to pass within tens of miles of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, our U.S. base, that's a dot, when you go through the Panama Canal. So that's an important site.
Admiral, you've been terrific with your time, but we also, and sharing so much information with us, but we also know you have a regular job. So we'll take one last question before you head out. Anyone? Okay, right here.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. Thank you, Admiral. I thank you for your service in this very challenging. My name is Chin Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I thank the Admiral for the very challenging jobs that you've done very well.
Thank you.
And you made the statement that the U.S. has been in the Pacific for the last many decades. And actually, the U.S. has done all it can to maintain peace in that area so that China can rise to this present day when it is expanding its naval forces. And from what you're saying, we're still looking to embrace China to maintain the stability and the security in the region, especially in the South China Sea. Recently, you also mentioned we should note the carbon situation and the recent almost collision in the air and in the sea in many different incidents. But the U.S. still trying to embrace China. The questions raised by many of our Chinese news reporters say that China did not appreciate that. And they questioned the U.S. being in the international air. And they wanted the U.S. not to be there. So they wanted to set up a new norms and new standards. The recent happening in the South...
could you please just get to your question?
Yes, in the South China Sea, with what they're building in the Johnson Reefs, in the James Shoals, and what they're building in all other rocks areas to turn it into islands, meaning they're not honoring the international law. So to what extent, without sequestration, do you think the U.S. can continue to support China to violate all the international laws? And to what extent do you think our allies and our partners, including Vietnam, can understand your purpose in maintaining peace and stability in the region, to promote our trade, which you said over 500 million last year, but our trade deficit was almost 500 billion last year with China. Thank you.
Well, we need to, I think, bring the Chinese in all areas into the table of international meetings and norms and fora, and have these discussions, to your point, on what precisely, and then we'll be clear with each other and everybody, what are the international laws? Because I think they're getting fuzzy here and there. What's a law? What's a local law, if you will, a country law, a nation's claim, and what the international, the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea. That tends to be the best means, what it means and what it stands for. Thanks.
Thank you, Admiral. Please join me in thanking him for his.
Thank you.